it's not just going to help us repair errors or learn things. It's going to help us create. It's going to help us innovate.
Welcome to the Veterinary Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Butler Vet Insurance, hosted by Bill Butler. The Veterinary Blueprint Podcast is for veterinarians and practice managers who are looking to learn about working on their practice instead of in their practice. Each episode, we will bring you successful, proven blueprints from others both inside and outside the veterinary industry. Welcome to today's episode.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Veterinary Blueprints Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Butler. Today, we're shining a spotlight on a topic that's paramount to every veterinary entrepreneur leadership. And who better to guide us today than our special guest, Josh Vaisman. Josh's journey into the veterinary community began in 1998, and he has navigated everything from practice management to ownership, understanding not only the challenges, but also the joys of leading a veterinary hospital and team. He is not only recognized as an expert on this topic within the community, but he has also offered a book called Lead to Thrive, The Science of Crafting a Positive Veterinary Culture. So we'll dig into that a little bit today as well. His dedication goes beyond the written word. He has co-founded Flourish Veterinary Consulting to make tangible and positive changes in veterinary workplaces. And I had the pleasure of hearing Josh speak a few weeks ago on the 4 Ps of positive leadership, a framework for leading thriving veterinary teams at a recent veterinary practice leadership summit, and knew that I needed to have him speak with all of you today on the podcast. So today's podcast promises to be insightful, especially for those who have felt the pressures of leadership. I know I have in my business. So let's journey into the realm of positive veterinary leadership with the wisdom and experience Josh is going to bring to us. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. You've set the bar high, that this is going to be insightful. So now, I feel like I should be asking you questions instead.
Well, what would you like to know about leadership? I'll try my best. So for our listeners who don't know who Josh is and what you've done, I think you've got a very interesting story. And when you were sharing that at the leadership summit, I found your background and your, kind of where you came from to where you are is a very interesting story. So why don't you share a little bit about your background as we get started today?
Yeah, happy to do so. So I like to joke that I kind of stumbled into veterinary medicine. I actually didn't really have a lifelong intention of getting into this field, but 18, 19, 20 years old, not really knowing what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was working in a PetSmart, and they had a PetSmart veterinary services there. And I kind of befriended some of the people that work there. I'd spend time there on my breaks and a little bit of off time, and got really interested and ended up taking a job there as a tech assistant. And that's kind of how I fell into the profession. Haven't really looked back since. That was in the late 90s. I worked at this hospital for 3 or 4 years. And then the chief of staff left and opened up a private practice of his own. And I went on to a couple other different hospitals in the area. And then one day I'm working as a technician assistant at a practice in Boulder, Colorado, and a practice that I had worked at a few years prior was sold. And, the rumor mill, we hear about all these things and, oh yeah. So-and-so hospital was sold to a couple veterinarians and a vet tech. And I had no idea at the time that a non-DVM could actually have ownership stake in a veterinary practice. So here I'm making $9.50 an hour. Right. Like I'm not even like a credentialed anything. I didn't go to tech school. I didn't go to vet school, like none of this
You're
stuff.
the bottom of the food chain.
Yeah. Kind of the bottom of the food chain. And I'm thinking to myself, I could do this. I could run this place. It's a pretty audacious and a bit bombastic, but
sure. Yeah.
But I waltzed into the doctor's office. I sat down next to one of the docs that worked there at the time. She was an associate. I knew she had an interest in practice ownership, and I somehow convinced her to buy a vet hospital with me. 6 months later, her and another veterinarian there and myself purchased a small animal hospital. And that's how I got into ownership and management. And,
so trial by fire.
A trial by fire, 100%. Yeah. I did what I imagine a lot of people probably do. I found myself like, I had this cockamamie idea, and now it's becoming a reality. We've just signed, documents for a pretty massive loan, and we're going to be running this business. So I spent a few months kind of, diving into everything I could. I found resources through the VHMA, the Veterinary Hospital Managers Association, got connected with some hospital managers here in Colorado, a couple of which actually had non-DVM ownership. So I could
Okay.
get their, some of that perspective. I took some courses at the time. It was through Patterson University or
Okay.
Webster University. It was before it was Patterson. And I took some courses on like practice management, things like that. And we dove into this adventure, and it went pretty well. I was there for, I don't know, a little over 5 years. In that period of time, we took what was a one doctor practice with consecutive years of declining revenue, and we tripled the revenue. When I left
Okay.
the practice, there were 4 doctors on staff instead of just one. Like, we had some good success, and I thought, well, maybe I could duplicate this kind of success in multiple ventures, and got really interested in multi-practice ownership.
Okay.
If I'm being completely candid, I was chasing dollar signs.
Sure. I
And
mean,
yeah.
when there's kind of two levels of revenue or income within the veterinary communities. There's that associate level, and I know some of those numbers. The median salary for an associate in the United States is $107,000. That's the median across all states. Obviously, different markets are going to have different revenues, but if you're a veterinary practice owner, that's a much different metric. And it's the same thing in the insurance industry that I practice in, helping veterinarians. The ownership chair is always the one, but you also have all the risk, and that's part of our conversation today is everyone looks to you for the leadership piece, right? So it's that risk reward. The reward is there financially, but probably, and I think your story that you were telling, and I'll let you get back to it, is that you do have a lot of that stress and struggle of leadership because you are the person who everyone looks to.
Right. Yeah. And the burden of responsibility sits squarely on your shoulders in that position, for sure. I don't think I really fully realized that. And so we had success in this one practice, a good bit of success. When I left there, we were running at 26% EBITDA. So like, things were going really well. And I felt like I could replicate that and make more and more and more money. And so that's what I started chasing. And the reality is that, in the next venture that I went into, while there was financial success to an extent, what really ended up happening is I got so caught up on those numbers, I sort of lost sight of my values and the things that really led me to want to be in a position of leadership and have an impact on people. I started kind of setting people aside and unintentionally causing harm in others and inevitably myself. And then all of that stress and all of that, build up over time resulted in a pretty epic kind of burnout induced breakdown.
Sure.
And that got me out of ownership. I ended up selling my equity to my partners. I resigned my position as hospital director of the practice that I was leading there. I left the consulting firm I was a part of, and I didn't actually know what in the world I was going to do next. So I just kind of left vet med and ended up taking some time to kind of figure things out. And in the process of doing that, I discovered the field of applied positive psychology. And I felt like that was a lesson that I was probably really missing out on. And so I decided to go back to school. I went and pursued a master's in applied positive psychology and coaching psychology, got really interested in the science of positive leadership and positive organizational scholarship, and then got really, really passionate about and inspired to really bring the lessons of those kinds of things to the people in positions like what I had been in. People who are running veterinary practices, people who are leading teams of technicians and doctors, those kinds of things, so that the mistakes and the shortcomings and the pitfalls that I had run into that had ended up really kind of burning me out, that they wouldn't have to make those mistakes anymore. They wouldn't have to go through my mistakes, but even more so that it wouldn't be just about avoiding mistakes or not being a bad leader, but how do we ensure that we're actually really excelling in leadership in a way that, brings energy into the environment and contributes to a sense of joy and fulfillment in ourselves and the people around us. Because I actually think that that's kind of the most important part of being in a leadership position.
This episode of the Veterinary Blueprint podcast is sponsored by Butler Vet Insurance. Being an insurance agent at Butler Vet Insurance, I've seen firsthand the difficulties veterinarians face insuring their practices. But did you know we wrote the book on veterinary insurance? It's called Protecting Your Veterinary Practice: Insider Insurance Secrets Every Veterinarian Must Know. It's not just a book, it's a comprehensive guide that speaks to the unique challenges and insurance solutions for the veterinary community. With over 20 years of experience from cyber liability to business auto and workers' compensation, our aim at Butler Vet Insurance is to reduce the stress of insurance for those dedicated to animal care. If you're a practice owner or manager and looking for some guidance on your insurance, follow our insurance blueprint. Discover the Butler Vet difference, and together let's put the pieces of the puzzle together. Butler Vet Insurance, reducing the stress of insurance. From some of my own personal growth and professional development, I've learned that people want to belong to something.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of books about that, but we're inherently a tribal people. We want to belong to a tribe or a group, that clique in high school or whatever it might be. We want to belong to that. And if you can instill some of that sense of leadership and belonging and build your own tribe, you're always trying to build a tribe as a leader. And then, people will kind of naturally fall in line with that. Well, what do you think people, I think, we had chatted a little bit prior to this, and just, I wanted to find out what a couple things that you thought were really important, to convey to the veterinary community out there. And one thing that I'm interested in is, what do you think people are getting wrong in the veterinary community when it comes to leadership?
Yeah, I think that as a community generally, nothing is universal here. There are outliers and people who actually do this really quite well. But generally speaking, I think what we get wrong about leadership in the veterinary community is that we sort of conflate management and leadership. And while those two those two concepts live in the same zip code, they're typically not the same house. Management is a very tactical approach in my mind. When I think of managing a business, that's tactical. It's it tends to be very objective. It's about structure. It's about policies and procedures. It's about all of the elements that.
What's our turnaround time and appointments?
Yeah,
How
exactly.
many, are we full? What's
Yeah.
our inventory? How are we, what are our processes, and what's your pipeline look like? In the sales world I live in, it's what's your pipeline? How many calls have you made? Where are you at with stuff? That's just a mechanics, are the bills getting paid? That's just the
Yes.
mechanics of
Yes.
managing a team, or the ins and outs.
Right. Yes. And so we lean into these spaces that require a leadership approach. Like, for, an example that's very common in a veterinary practice, you've got a whole team and a schedule that you have to meet, right? We've got to be able to see patients throughout the day. These are the hours we're open. These are our appointment slots. We got to make sure we have a team. This idea of retention and turnover and the workforce shortage is very, very common in the lexicon in veterinary conversations these days. We tend to approach those kinds of things with writing a schedule and all that stuff through the lens of management. Even when we're in a leadership position, we're typically doing that through management. Well, here's the deal. These are the hours that we're open. These are the number of shifts I need to fill. Everybody pulls their equal weight, so we're all going to get scheduled with some level of equality. And then what happens? We post the schedule, and two technicians are pissed off that we haven't met their requests, or that they're working it's the fourth Saturday in a row, wherever it might be. And three other team members are pissed off, but they're not actually telling us about it. We're hearing about it second and third hand, right? Because we've applied a management approach to something that requires a bit of leadership. And I think that's the problem, is we think of leadership as tactical. Leadership is relational.
Agreed, 100%. So haven't talked a lot about this on the podcast, but my background is, I don't have a college degree. My background is military. I had 12 years in the military before joining my parents at the insurance agency that they started.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I really wasn't sure that insurance was something that I wanted to do with a military background, but I found I really liked insurance. But coming from the military, here I am 20 years later, but the military, the thing that we always, it's where I went to basic training, the training patch that the instructors had was follow me.
Mm.
And it's the lead from the front mentality. And the question that I always want to be asking myself leading my team is, would I follow me?
Yeah.
And if I wouldn't follow me, then, I probably have a problem
Yeah.
with somewhere in my leadership and what I'm doing and how I'm behaving. And I'm a big fan of John Maxwell. I got a wall of books here behind me, and I'm a big fan of John Maxwell, and he's got levels of leadership. And, one of those levels of leadership is, I'm the boss. You have to do what I say. Well, that's kind of the management style of leadership. Hey, here's the schedule. Everyone's going to abide by the schedule. And what you're talking about is more of that leading from the front, intrinsic. I want to follow this leader because they're a good person, and I think they're
Yes.
leading us in the right direction. A lot of that also has to do with vision, correct? Like, people want to buy into the vision of a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see vision and leadership kind of combining together in the veterinary world?
I think that, okay, so let me just clarify what you mean by that. So vision, when you say vision, I think what you're getting at, Bill, is you're talking about the leader having a very clear purpose to what we're doing. This is where we're
Correct.
going. This is why we're going there.
Yeah. So, in the world of insurance, in Butler Vet Insurance, we want to take the stress of insurance off veterinarian shoulders. And so that's a clear vision for our team. Like, everything we're doing, whether it's our sales process, our renewal process, how we handle customer service, is trying to take the stress of insurance off veterinarian shoulders.
Yep.
In the pet service world, that could be, we want to be best in the world. I'm also a big Jim Collins fan. We want to be best in the world at companion animal practice. We think we can be best in the world in dogs and cats or hamsters or whatever it might be, and then creating that vision for the team. And that allows you as a leader to set the tone of what we're doing and why we're doing certain things versus, hey, we're trying to make a buck. We got to pack the schedule. Everyone's got to work their shifts, and sorry, you're pissed off, from a leadership example. So that's, I think, where I was talking about trying to combine the vision for our practice and how we operate in conjunction with leadership. And the absence of that vision can create some of those conflicts, because now you're just managing versus leading.
I think you're spot on there. I 100% agree. I think that we can do a lot better job at activating the implied purpose in the work that we do in veterinary medicine. I have a friend, he's a researcher at the Colorado State University Center for Meaning and Purpose. His name is Dr. Zach Mercurio. And Zach often talks about how, one of the challenges in especially like service type fields like veterinary medicine is that in the initial stages, when you join a profession like veterinary medicine, it is a very highly crystallized coming together of what and why. Like, what draws you to the profession, whatever that sense of purpose is in the individual, it is this work that defines your capacity to activate that purpose. So the what and the why are very, very closely aligned. But what happens is, even in the most meaningful work, even in the most purpose-driven work, when you do it routinely, day after day, for hours and hours on end, weeks and months and years, over time, the why and the what start to separate. And there's this big gap between this is what I do and this is the purpose of it. We lose sight of it. It's hard to see. It's hard to feel. So the purposeful becomes mundane. Having clear vision, especially from people in charge, people in that leadership position, that clear vision that can be articulated, that can be repeated, that is always focused on that, like what you referred to when you talked about your business venture and trying to take the weight of insurance off the shoulders of veterinarians. When that becomes the algorithm through which we make decisions, that level of clarity is incredibly powerful, because it attracts people that have an alignment of those values. And it also
helps build that tribe.
Yeah, exactly.
You're either on board with what our vision is and what we're doing, or you're not. And if you're not, you can't be part of our team.
Yeah. I think thinking back to your experience in the military, if you had somebody in, I don't know, you're going to have to forgive me because I'm terrible with the terminology, but it's your platoon, I guess.
Yep.
If you had somebody in your platoon who was clearly not bought in to why you were all there, how long would that person have lasted?
Well, they couldn't go anywhere, but their life was miserable because they weren't part of the team.
Yeah.
You were either on the team or you weren't on the team.
Yeah.
And it was like Animal House meets You were either in the group or you weren't in the
Or
group.
you weren't. Yeah. And you
And,
knew it.
we lived in barracks. You weren't allowed, like you came to our floor on our barracks is like, who are you and why are you here? You're not part of our tribe.
Yeah.
And, we're wearing the same uniform, but you're in a different unit than us. You're not part of our crew.
You're not part of our crew.
And so, and that's why I find the concept of leadership fascinating, regardless of business, just because, if you can build a team that is part of your tribe or willing to follow you, then, it makes that, hey, I need you to work the extra shift on Tuesday. Okay. Because I'm on the same vision path as everyone else here versus, yep, we're just here, animal health, trying to keep the schedule full. And, that's where some of that, it takes some of the burnout away.
100%.
Not that you can alleviate it completely, but when people are bought in.
It helps. So Christine Maslach and Michael Leiter are kind of like the preeminent scholars on the experience of occupational burnout. And in the late 90s, they published a piece of work that basically demonstrated that there are 6 domains of work life that can contribute to, satisfaction at work or lead to burnout. One of those is values congruence. If there's a misalignment in values between the people doing the work and the work that they're doing, that is painful psychologically, and it wears on you. And over time, if you stay in that kind of environment, you're going to be harmed because of it. So having this clear vision articulated and consistently drawn upon from the leader is an essential way to create values congruence. I think it also has this wonderful side benefit. When I hear you talk about either you're in our platoon or you're not, either you're part of this unit or you're not, that togetherness that you created within that unit, it makes, like what you said, like, hey, can you pick up this shift on Tuesday? What it does is it shifts it from an individual metric to a group metric. When we have a very clear idea of purpose and vision that everybody's kind of bought into and on board with, the scorecard becomes collaborative. It becomes a group scorecard. So it's not about, well, I picked up 2 shifts last week, so now it's your turn. It's about, what do we need as a group right now, and what part can I play in getting us there? Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, kind of shifting into rethinking veterinary leadership and critical for business success. And so, I think that, there's kind of 2 components there, right? You've got somebody, and, I fell into this, right? I just happen to have leadership background and came into insurance, and very few people actually, when they start in the insurance industry, do they decide that insurance is for them. But, much like you, fell into this. And so, but, fortunately for me, I had a lot of leadership experience, but for a lot of veterinarians that, I work with, they have this entrepreneurial kind of bug, kind of like you had. Hey, I think I can do this too. They're veterinarians. They go to school to be a veterinarian, and then they wind up in a leadership role. So rethinking leadership and how is that critical for business success? I mean, we've kind of been really diving into that, but where do you see that as something that veterinarians really should hone in on to be able to take their practice to the next level, or maybe alleviate some leadership issues that they feel they're having?
Oh gosh, I don't even know where to start there. It's a really great question. I think what you're asking is what would be the recommended place to begin to amplify
reading your
or
book,
up-level? Yeah,
buying your book off the AHA website, which we'll have in the show notes, by the way.
Thank you.
If you're an AHA member, it's discounted. And you dive into the 4 P's of pillars of leadership there. And that might be, one thing that I've done is how to better myself and reading books on, because at the end of the day, I think there's some specific things to the veterinary industry that are very unique to them. But at the end of the day, leadership principles are leadership principles.
Yes.
And so why don't you talk about some that are in your book that are very specific to the veterinary industry? Why don't you, talk about the 4 pillars?
Sure.
Because that was what you spoke about and how those can impact a veterinary practice.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair to say that veterinary medicine is its own unique profession. It is, at least in some ways, parallel to, if not ancillary to, human medicine. And so the first pillar that we talk about in the book is this idea of psychological safety. Ultimately, what I encourage leaders to think of that as is creating a culture where voice isn't just expected, it's encouraged and celebrated. It's one thing to say, I have an open door policy. It's a completely different thing for people to believe it.
Sure.
And so we have to close that gap as leaders. One of the primary reasons why is because we know in human medicine, this research has not been conducted yet in veterinary medicine, but in human medicine, there's a direct relationship between the presence or absence of psychological safety within the healthcare team and the number of medical errors that occur. Vis-a-vis
Wow.
when there is higher levels of psychological safety, when we have a healthcare team where anybody in the team feels like, even if I'm just the medical assistant walking by and the top surgeon in the world is in the OR and I see something that's off, I know I can speak up and say, hey guys, you might want to look at this, and nobody's going to roll their eyes at me or yell at me or get mad at me. I'm not going to risk losing my job or be pulled off that shift. There's not going to be any retribution.
We actually had
Because
that in the military.
yeah, exactly.
So, if you see a safety violation on the range, everyone's a range safety officer. If you see a safety violation, anybody, whether it's a private or usually it is the private, seeing the officers. I was not an officer. You usually see the officers making some sort of mistake. So
Yeah,
that anyone should be able to call out that error at any point and identify that in the team. So that's a really great point, that have that openness within your practice to
right.
understand that, hey, if there's something that we can do, but I don't have all the answers about how to do stuff. And I've got some team members at my practice who are in their 20s and they've got a different perspective, and just say, hey, I don't know how to do everything. If somebody can see something or see something, say something, kind of thing.
Yeah, we know. Like, so there's two things I want to share about that. First of all, I want to point out what you said about having that in the military. I would be willing to bet that from unit to unit, the frequency at which a private would speak to call out an officer's mistake probably varies, because even though
Absolutely.
it's a policy, right?
It's based on the culture of the unit.
Exactly. And so it's not enough for us to know that we need to. When I work with veterinary practices, or I'm talking at events and working with hospital owners, medical directors, practice managers, there's almost never a person in the room that argues with the sentiment that, yeah, people should be able to speak up if they can prevent a mistake or help us learn something new. But having the policy is not actually
whether or not they
creating
feel
the culture.
empowered to actually do it, right?
Exactly. The other thing that I'll share with you about this, speaking to the scientific minds of the veterinarians that might be hearing this podcast, we know from social science research, we know that you can take an expert in a field and then ask them to make predictions about things related to that field. So, for example, you could take a meteorologist, right, and give them a bunch of data and ask them to predict the weather, and they're going to have a very high success rate. But if you take multiple people who even have a cursory knowledge, large numbers of people, 100 people, 500 people, who even have cursory knowledge of that area of study of meteor, they're like citizen scientists, right? And you ask them as a group to make predictions, that group's prediction is almost always going to be more accurate than the individual experts. That's
Wow.
because collective knowledge always usurps individual knowledge. And so another reason why we've got to be sure that we're not just saying, writing in the handbook, I've got an open door policy. That's not enough. Actually going out there and creating that empowerment. So like you said, people feel like they have the power to actually use their voice. It's not just going to help us repair errors or learn things. It's going to help us create. It's going to help us innovate. I mean, major organizations Google trains all of their managers on how to cultivate psychological safety in their teams, because it's that important to them. It should be that important to us.
So one thing I've done with my business is, we have a lot of events out in the community. So we're not just sitting in our office. So whenever I have the opportunity with my team and we're out doing, in the car, driving somewhere, not in an office environment, somewhere, that's a little bit different than what we're in every day, I'll say, what questions do you have about the business? And a lot of times they're asking, like, where are we going? What's the next plan? Where do you see things happening within our industry and what we're working on? And I say, I'll answer any question that I'm able to answer that doesn't, I won't say this is how much money I make as the owner of the business, but anything that's, that they're curious about within the realm of what's happening, I want to have them and foster that environment. So that way they feel kind of that empowerment of, hey, I'm involved. I see where
Yeah.
the vision is. Otherwise, you know, one other kind of to drill back to the military is the one thing that I personally, and I'm biased, thinks that makes the U.S. military so much better than many other militaries in the world is from the officer on top all the way down to the lowest private. When you step out to do that mission, everyone knows what the commander's intent is. That's where you
Yeah.
start. The
Yeah.
commander's intent is to go and attack this, road intersection, or attack this village, or capture this person, or defend this point of land. And so the command, the intent is, this is what we're doing. So when all the leaders are gone, unfortunately, in the military, that the lower ranking enlisted actually can accomplish the mission because they know what the commander's intent is. So you want to have a whole team out there that, in the absence of leadership, know the right thing to do and can empower. They've been empowered over time to follow the commander's intent, or in the case of a veterinary practice, the practice manager or the owner. I think, of the other two, purpose, path, and partnership, we've talked about purpose and definitely partnership, cultivating inclusion and belongingness. Talking about in a veterinary practice, what does it look like? If Josh was running his own practice again today, what does path look like? Celebrating and developing strengths.
Yeah. So path pulls from a couple different things. It pulls a little bit from the science of human motivation, and it pulls a little bit from some applied positive psychology. Oftentimes, historically, the way that we approached human resource development was kind of like from a weakness mindset, right? Like, Bill, listen, you're doing really, really great here, but gosh, you're really falling short in this area. Let's work on strengthening that up. Now, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that. What I worry about is when we focus solely on weaknesses, what we get is a mindset that looks only for weaknesses. And what we learn from positive psychology is that actually quite a lot of psychological, emotional, well-being energy comes from the focus on strengths. Bill, you probably don't really find yourself lighting up and getting really energized and feeling alive when you're trying to fix a weakness. But gosh, when you're doing something that aligns your strengths and your values, I'll bet you lose sense of time. I'll bet you get
You get into the flow mindset, the state of flow, right?
Exactly. So the path pillar is about, as a leader, making sure that we learn, understand, and recognize the strengths of the individuals on our team and the collective strengths as well, looking at the team as a whole. That we learn to, notice and recognize those things. And then we find ways to tie your personal values and purpose to the higher purpose and values of the organization, of the practice, of the team, of whatever it might be.
So that's part of sharing the vision, right?
Exactly.
You have to share the vision so they can tie that in. It can't be a secret.
And helping you find, where can your unique strengths insert a piece of the puzzle that we're currently missing that will help us get closer to our vision.
Sure.
So that it's really just about thinking about professional development in a slightly different way. Instead of making you better at something you suck at, hey, let's find the things that you really light up doing, and let's find a way to help you get even better at that, or do more of that in a way that also helps us deliver on our purpose and vision.
So that in my reading of businesses and what success looks like for them, there's stories of a business knowing that they have a top tier person for a C-suite, but they can't find the right fit for them, and they will put them in 5 or 6 different roles.
Yeah, because
they know they've got a really talented individual that they don't want to let go. But we have to figure out where this person's talents and gifts really lie. So that, it goes back to Jim Collins. You got to have the right person in the right seat on the bus. And you might have the right person, but they might not be on the right seat on your bus. They might not be good in the front desk, or they might not be good as a tech, but as a practice manager, they all of a sudden excel. That face-to-face human interaction with a customer, they might not be good at, but they might excel at the details and that actual management piece that needs to be done, the day-to-day ordering of supplies and
Yes.
scheduling and
100%.
payroll.
Yeah.
But they might be awful at customer service. And if they speak to another client, you're going to lose half your
You're going
client
to lose
base.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's figuring out where to excel. And I know that, there's two parts of that too, right? It's not just the practice employee, it's also the owner themselves, right? The
Yes.
manager, the practice manager, the veterinary owner. And in the circles that I'm in with other entrepreneurs, we talk about operating in our talents and gifts. And everyone has 3 top talents or gifts, figuring out what those are. And then you should be operating in those talents or gifts 80% of the time
I
as a
totally agree.
business owner, whatever
I
it is.
totally agree. The problem is that oftentimes, again, I think this harkens back to the original, question, the early part of our conversation, that difference between leadership and management. I think when we put on our management hats, we are looking at individuals as assets to get us to our goal of whatever we're
Sure.
trying to accomplish, right? And so how do I fit all the puzzle pieces in the way that makes sense for me? That's problematic. So an example of what I mean by this and how this ties to that path pillar and everything that you just shared. I worked years ago. I worked with an associate veterinarian. Now, the hospital that I worked at was her second practice. The first practice that she was at, she ended up leaving kind of in a bit of a ball of flames, if you will. That practice expected all of their veterinarians to do things exactly the same way. You're a veterinarian here. You're going to see patients for a number of days. You're going to be sort of our treatment doctor for a number of days, and you're going to do surgery for a number of days. And that's just part of how we do things here. Well, she was terrible at surgery, not because she was unskilled, but because it made her so unbelievably anxious to be in the OR that she really, really struggled with it. And this hospital kept trying to force her as a circle into a square hole. And they, gave her mandatory continuing education to try and improve her surgery skills that she was weak at, very management kind of approach thing. And
it wasn't a mechanical error.
Yes.
It was a mental error.
Exactly.
Or not error, but just a mental block.
A mental block, and something that really you could think of it as sort of like flipping the script on what you and your entrepreneurial colleagues talk about. Instead of putting her 80% in the place where she lit up, where her strengths and gifts were, they were forcing her to spend 80% of her time and energy on something that just drained her. And eventually she left. The hospital that I worked at with her, for whatever reason, somebody in a position of authority there got her to open up enough to share that she really just didn't want to have to do surgery. And so they created a position for her where she never had to do surgery. And as somebody who only saw appointments, she was one of the top producing doctors in that practice because she loved being in the exam room with clients so much that her best self came out every time. And because they were willing to make this slight concession for her, instead of approaching things from, everything's got to be equal for everybody, applying what you might think of as an equity.
So what if you had a
prism.
veterinarian who just loved, look, I don't want to talk to anyone. I just want to I want to do 15 surgeries a day, do my stuff and go
What
home.
a great compliment it would have been to this doctor, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you've got so figuring out where, the last hire at our agency was a woman. She's very good. And she said, I absolutely do not want to sell anything. My last job, I had to sell. I'm coming to an insurance agency. I don't want to sell anything. I said, no problem. We don't need you to sell. We just need you in the office doing customer service stuff. She said, great. And it's been a good, and so just understanding the strengths of your team and where they excel and then getting them into those positions. Well, we could probably talk about leadership for like 3 hours, I think, Josh, but if you were going to tell veterinarians and practice managers, leave them with one tidbit or one piece of advice that they could bring back to their practices today and help with their leadership skills, or just kind of solve a problem that they might have with leadership, what do you close your talks with?
Yeah. So I think the one piece of advice that I would close things off with, I'm going to start from a nerdy perspective, but then get to the more personal. The research by Marsha Losada and I can't remember her last name now, Hefe, found that the highest performing teams had a very close ratio of what they called basically like curiosity and inquisition. So basically these teams seem to do really, really well, in part because they were very curious and asked each other a lot of questions. I think that applies to leadership. Everything that you and I have talked about requires a level of understanding. It requires a level of connectivity. And to create high quality human connections, that can't happen if you're not leaning into using your curiosity muscles. You said something earlier. You said that you ask your team, what do you want to know about the business? That's the fact that you're even thinking of asking that question has already put you at the higher echelons of leadership. And then repeatedly using those questions to understand things about them and help them gain understanding. So just find ways to ask more questions. Just get curious. If you think you know something, challenge your assumption and ask a question about it. If they give you a short answer, ask another question. Get a layer deeper with people. That will create connection that will lead to all of this stuff being 10 times easier.
One thing that I've learned in sales, Josh, if you didn't get the answer you're looking for, your question probably sucked. And the other thing I've learned about just overall leadership, sales, everything is ask good pointed questions and then shut the heck up.
Yes.
And let them answer the question. And people will tell you, if you ask a good question, people will tell you exactly what they want to know. All right, what's the last piece on the personal side? You gave us the nerdy thing.
That was the personal.
That was the
bringing
personal
it to the
thing.
personals.
Right.
Questions create personal connection. That's just how it is. You talk about the sales side, so I think of it in when I travel, I find myself doing this a lot. One of the best ways to get somebody to like you, if that's what you're after, is just ask them questions about themselves. You get people talking about themselves, and that's instant connection.
They're always playing the radio station. Do you know which one it is?
No.
WIIFM. What's in it for me? And asking questions about them. What are you interested in? What do you like?
Yeah.
The other thing that from the sales word is be interested, not interesting. People always try and be interesting and look how cool I am. But if you're more interested in other people, they will have a bigger connection to you. Well, I really want to thank you, Josh, for taking the time out today to join us on the podcast. If veterinarians and practice managers are trying to find you online, I know you're pretty active on LinkedIn. Where can they find you and your team if they're looking to connect with you?
Yeah, so you can find us on our website at www.flourish.vet, FLOURISH.VET. You can also find us on Instagram and on Facebook. And then, I'm very active on LinkedIn as well, personally.
Great. Well, we'll also have those links in the show notes, along with a copy of where they can get a copy of your book, where I'm sure you dive into some more of this. Again, thanks so much, Josh. And if you're listening to this podcast, make sure to like, click, and share this with your fellow veterinarians. It helps get the word out to other people who might be looking for some information on this. So thanks for joining us on this episode of the Veterinary Blueprints podcast, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.